Hello, fellow rebel capitalists. Hope you're well. Have a story about the trade deficit, which applies to all of the shortages that you've been seeing, most likely in your local grocery store over the past few months. A lot of these shortages have been attributed to the supply chain bottlenecks that we hear about all the time in the news. And of course, Biden, we talked about that last week, where he's coming in and trying to save the day because the free market just isn't working, and it just can't. It isn't. The free market isn't efficient enough. It isn't smart enough to solve these problems. So we need the central planners to come in and really save the day. Yeah, we've seen that in the news. But I was listening to the Peter Schiff podcast, my good buddy Peter Schiff. And so I want to give him all the credit here. And he talked about another reason why these shortages have occurred over the past few months and why we're seeing all these ships just docked out in the middle of the ocean waiting to come into port, and why that infrastructure is being strained to such a significant degree. And so first, we've got stimmy checks, talked about that. You're incentivizing people to stay home. Therefore, it's harder for the ports to get employees to work these shifts needed to bring in all the stuff that's on the boats. And then you don't have any truck drivers. So then how do you get the goods from the port to the actual store itself? And then the store doesn't have enough people to stock the shelves. And it goes back to the distortions the government has created since March of 2020 that have incentivized fewer people to actually work. But there's more to it, and that's what I've been focusing on. But let's dive into this chart, and you'll see what I'm referring to. And if you listen to Schiff's last podcast or the podcast prior, he explains this in great detail as well. So this is a chart going back to the 1990s for the U.S. trade deficit. And if you're not familiar with the trade deficit, this is the balance of trade. I would just say trade deficit because we've never had a surplus. Well, we have, but not for a long, long time. So anytime you see a chart of the balance of trade, it might as well be a chart of the trade deficit. But joking aside here, you can see going back to the 90s, we were almost flat. And what this is a measurement of is the delta between how much we import compared to how much we export. So if we're importing more stuff than we export, then we have a trade deficit. And then if we export more than we import, then we have a trade surplus. So Japan, Germany, these are countries that historically have large trade surpluses because they produce a lot of stuff. And that's one of the reasons why the yen hasn't completely tanked, because there's so much demand that's created for yen because they have so many exports. So when they're exporting stuff, they're importing currency, and vice versa. If you're importing stuff, then you're exporting currency on net balance. So that's why Schiff always talks about the twin deficit. And Gunlock actually talks about the twin deficit all the time as well. So you have the budget deficit. We all know what that is. That's when the government is spending far more money than they are collecting through tax collection. But then we have the trade deficit, which means we're importing more goods. So by definition, that means we are exporting more dollars out into the global economy. The more dollars that are out circulating in the global economy, simple supply and demand, that means that there is downward pressure on the dollar. Now, that doesn't mean that the dollar goes down. That just means that that is a headwind for the dollar globally against other fiat currencies. And if it got to such an extreme, then that would definitely move the, I don't want to say the price, but that would definitely decrease the value of the dollar relative to other currencies on the DXY. So as an example, the trade deficit right now around 70 billion a month, which is really a staggering number. I think that's the largest trade deficit of all time. But let's just say that that was 700 billion, or let's just say it was 7 trillion to really take it to an extreme. Then you would see significant. I mean, the dollar would tank on the DXY relative to pretty much every currency because you'd have so many more dollars leaving the United States and circulating in the global economy. So that's why these deficits are so important. That's why Schiff and Gunlock always talk about them. But Schiff brings up a very interesting point. Let's go back to prior to the cerveza sickness when the trade deficit was running about $40 billion per month. And just within a matter of 2 or 3 months, because of the lockdowns here in the United States, and then, of course, the stimmy checks where we're paying people to stay home and not produce goods and services. Therefore, so demand stays the same. Incomes actually went up. But yet, where do those goods come from? See, we got to get them from somewhere. We're not producing them. So we have to import more goods than we were importing before. So we go in a very short time, we go from a trade deficit of 40 billion down to almost 80 billion. Well, think about what that does to the infrastructure that we currently have. I mean, look at this going from back during, and that's what's really interesting here as well. Look at the GFC. The GFC, the opposite happened. Well, why was that? Because demand plummeted. Demand absolutely tanked because no one had any money. Because the government didn't come in and do stimmy checks. And how interesting is that? And that doesn't necessarily mean that the economy is getting healthier from a standpoint of our trade deficit being reduced. It means that the economy is still extremely unhealthy because we are just consuming a lot less. So there's a lot of nuance in this chart, which I find very interesting. But then when we have the next massive recession, we actually see the opposite happen, where demand stays the same, but we have fewer goods and services. Where over in the GFC, we saw demand plummet while we have the same amount of goods and services. Regardless, going back to my point, is we see all these ships off the coast of California packed with stuff, just waiting out there at port. Why? Well, most likely, it's for the reasons we always talk about on this channel, but additionally, it's because the infrastructure was built from, let's say, 2010 to roughly 2020. So for 10 years, they had enough staff, they had enough, they had enough docks. Let's say they had enough materials, they had enough machines to handle 40 billion of stuff coming in off ships, and then that's doubled. So if that doubles almost, 2 or 3 months, it's not like all of the things needed to handle a ship coming in is something that you can create with just a snap of your fingers. So that is another reason we have all of this additional, all these additional shortages that you see. I mean, I went to Whole Foods last night. I posted that on Twitter, and there was several shelves that just had nothing. There were some of the freezer departments that you open the door, nothing in there. And I mean, this is at Whole Foods right in the middle of Phoenix. So I'm sure a lot of you are seeing that in your local grocery store. My point is we've got to understand why these shortages are happening and what government policies are creating these shortages, and then ask ourselves the question, is the probability high that these government distortions will continue into the future? So we say, okay, trade deficit going up, stimmies, fewer people working, more regulation from government. Is that going to increase or decrease in the future if the administration has their way? And if the politicians, I don't want to lay it all at the foot of the current administration, because all the politicians in one way, shape, or form are to blame for this. But if the central planners and the politicians have their way, are we going to see more stimmies, hashtag UBI, Are we going to see more regulation? Hashtag medicine mandates. Oh, if you don't get the medicine, you're fired. So these ports, these trucking companies, these logistics companies, FedEx maybe, they're going to have to fire 20% of their staff. So that means more people at home, fewer people actually producing or helping to transport with logistics the goods and services that are sitting there just floating at sea. So more of those people are staying home. But the takeaway here is, are we going to see more of that in the future or less of that? And I believe that we're going to see much, much more of the universal basic income. We're going to see more regulations. We're going to see tougher policies regarding health passports, medicine mandates, which will create an environment where fewer people are actually working in the United States, which does what to the trade deficit? It increases it even further, because there's no decrease in the amount of demand from a standpoint of dollars on the balance sheet of non-bank entities in the real economy, but yet we are producing far less stuff. And oh, by the way, our logistics infrastructure is able to transport far less stuff. So then you have to ask yourself the question, okay, what does that mean for the rate of inflation? What does that mean for the dollar if the trade deficits are going to go from 80 billion a month to 160? Now, is that enough to counter the collapse in China if we see a big recession or depression there? Therefore, create more pressure on those companies, those global corporations that have dollar-denominated debt, because that would be another cross current that would give a tailwind to the dollar globally, while at the same time we're doing everything domestically we possibly can to reduce the value of the dollar. So let me say it a little bit different way there. So what's happening in China right now is putting upward pressure on the dollar on the DXY when you're measuring the dollar against other fiat currencies. What we're doing domestically is putting downward pressure on the dollar on the DXY because of all the additional dollars that we will be exporting out into the global economy. Right now, I'm not talking about inflation domestically. I'm just talking about the dollar, the amount of dollars that are circulating around the globe that are available to pay down dollar-denominated debt. So that's a very interesting push-pull game of tug-of-war that we really need to be aware of. Why? We see domestic inflation right now in goods and services for supply side reasons, and because demand didn't go down like it naturally would in a recession because of the stimmy checks. Okay, we got that. But what we haven't seen is a massive, massive inflow of dollars from everywhere outside of the United States, because they are worried about losing purchasing power of the dollars they own relative to their own currency. This is what Schiff talks about all the time, and we haven't really seen it yet. This is like global Gresham's law. You can imagine if you were a wealthy person, let's say in Mexico, and your assets, your expenses were all denominated in pesos. Okay. Well, let's just say that you have $100 million in cash, and you see the value of the dollar tanking relative to the peso, and you believe that it's going to continue to tank. Well, what are you going to do with those $100 million? You're going to get rid of them as fast as you can. They become this proverbial hot potato. So you're either going to buy U.S. assets. Well, if you do that, what happens to that $100 million? They come back into the United States and circulate, because now they're on the balance sheet of non-bank entities in the real economy and the domestic economy. You see, so these are all factors that are in play right now. And this is why we need to pay attention to the trade deficit. This is why we need to pay attention to the medicine mandates, and it's why we need to pay attention to UBI, stimmy checks, central bank digital currency, etc. So many people on Twitter and social media, and even here on YouTube, say, "Oh, George, you just stop talking about medicine mandates. You need to focus on macro. You're so much better on macro. When it comes to economics, you really know your stuff. But when it comes to the medicine mandates, oh, you don't know what you're talking about." That could be the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life, because we have never seen anything that impacts macro more than the government's response to the cerveza sickness. Never, ever, ever, ever. So how could I or anyone else completely ignore what's going on with the cerveza sickness and ignore the fact that Biden is coming out and saying that every employer with over 100 employees has to basically fire anyone that doesn't want to inject a foreign substance into their body? How can I just completely ignore that when I'm trying to figure out the macroeconomic landscape? I mean, it's utter nonsense. Anyone that says that truly is just displaying their ignorance when it comes to understanding macroeconomics. But aside from that, I want to encourage all of you guys to not only follow the stimmy checks, the incentives for employees to work or not work, the mandates, which will lead more people to be unemployed, therefore not producing, but also pay attention to the twin deficits. We pay a lot of attention to the budget deficit, but let's not forget the trade deficit. And again, I want to thank Peter Schiff for bringing that up in his most recent podcast. Okay, let's see. We've got a couple super chats here, guy. Josh actually isn't here right now. His flight was delayed, so I'm having to do this myself. Next, Rebel Capitalist Live in Las Vegas. Oh, sorry, Phil. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. I think it would be too harsh for me to say I hate Las Vegas. Maybe a better way to say that is just currently, I hate Las Vegas. Hopefully that will change, because Las Vegas used to be one of my favorite places on the planet Earth. And if you're from Las Vegas, if you live there, I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. In the last 2 years, I have seen Las Vegas go from one of the funnest, coolest places on the planet Earth to a complete ghetto, where I mean, you really couldn't pay me to go to Las Vegas right now. So not only do you have to deal with, going into what effectively is a ghetto in every single uh, hotel and casino, but then to add insult injury, they make you wear a mask. You've got mask Nazis everywhere. I mean, this. I want nothing to do with Las Vegas right now. Sorry. Okay, all those containers from China just sitting there. Wonder what's in them. Just goods. Sure does seem like a good play to park offensive weapons. Yeah, I don't know about that. I don't know if I'd go that far, Jay. Maybe, maybe. But so many people think that I've had a lot of people over the weekend, a lot of buddies of mine say, "Oh, a lot of them are Trump fans." And they say, "Oh, well, see, this is what Trump was talking about. If we would just make this stuff here, we wouldn't have these problems." No, no, we'd still have these problems, because it's not the fact that the foreigners aren't producing enough stuff. It's all just floating out in the water. The problem is getting it from the ocean to the grocery store shelves. That's the issue we have here, or that's the main issue, I should say. It's not that the foreigners aren't producing enough stuff. Now, long term, I would agree that is a huge, huge problem, because we are consuming far more than we produce. But right now, the biggest problem we have is just the logistics, because we've overwhelmed the infrastructure, but yet we have fewer workers out there able to do the work required to get the stuff from the ship to the port, to the grocery store, and then onto the shelves. Okay, I'm not sure if that's. I thought I saw one more super chat there. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Make sure you continue to stand up, fight for freedom, liberty, and free market capitalism. I'll see you in the next video.